Welcome to It's About Data, episode 72. We're chatting with Suresh Srinivas, CEO of Collate. All right, Suresh, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
And that's an introduction that will likely include some of the early days of big data.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Hi to all the listeners of the podcast. My name is Suresh Srinivas. I've been in data space for a long time, starting with building Hadoop as a core team at Yahoo, which started all this big data, revolution, right? And when big data became a problem everywhere, especially in the enterprises where humongous data was being collected and then they needed to process it, we started a company. I was one of the co-founders of Hortonworks to bring Hadoop and the ecosystem to the enterprises to solve big data challenges. Towards the end of my Hortonworks days, I realized that we had this powerful, scalable storage and compute, but people were struggling to solve their big data problems. And many projects were failing. You needed army of developers for solving your creating value out of data, right? The companies were collecting. And so I wanted to understand these user side of challenges, joined Uber as chief architect of data there to understand the other side of, these platforms, how users use it, what are the challenges. Now, out of, having spent and solved some problems at Uber, realized that metadata is key to solving many of these challenges. And that's how, we started Open Metadata as an open source project. Now building open metadata as part of Collate, the company that we founded.
Yeah. So tell us about this open data project, open metadata project.
Yeah. So at Uber, right, we were having a lot of challenges. So one thing that I was seeing was, I wanted to join Uber and learn the user side of, how they are solving all these big data challenges, right? It was a company that was farther ahead in in terms of adopting these technologies and solving real problems with data. And so from outside it looks like a world class data company, right? And I joined day one. I realized that they also had all these challenges that other Hardenworks customers were having, right? So some metrics were broken, some key metrics for the business were unreliable. There were silent failures that were happening, right? That was going on for months. So we were getting wrong outcomes from data, and there was lack of trust about the data, right? So and I did a project there for almost an year where we did this, we had tried to solve this problem in the data warehouse. We had to, we tried to solve this problem in our ETL pipelines and things like that. These localized solutions were just banded, approaches. So we had to solve this problem end to end, starting from all the way from mobile devices all the way to data warehouses and dashboards and machine learning models. And one thing we realized was the main challenges that we were having because people did not understand the full context of data, right? And that full context of data is what metadata solves, right? Metadata provides you full context, and when we say full context, a lot of people have typically technical metadata, which gives you what is the structure of the data, where it is stored, what format it is stored in. This is very basic. Without this technical metadata, your data is nothing but gibberish, right? It's bits and bytes. To interpret these bits and bytes, you need technical metadata. But then there are many other things that are also required, right? That is sort of extension of this basic technical metadata where you have descriptive metadata where people are describing what this data is about and when to use it and this kind of stuff. When that is missing, people make assumptions, right? And these assumptions always lead to bad outcomes, right? And so that the descriptive metadata, there is also administrative metadata, right? Where to use it? Is it this has private privacy data that is private. It should not be used in some cases. Things like that. The compliance related metadata, without which you use it for wrong reasons and then you get GDPR fines, right? So we had
Yeah.
millions of GDPR fines, right, because of that. And then There are also things like, whether this data is high quality. Are there any, pipelines that are failed, because of which you're missing your, data. These things are, additional, data quality, observability related metadata, without which you're making assumption that your data is right, and then you're creating outcomes that are wrong, right? So we realize that this end-to-end metadata, the enriched metadata, is important to give full context of data to people so that they understand it and they use it the right way. Right? And having solved this problem with the metadata system that we built at Uber, we realized that metadata is such an important problem. It should be solved once for all, right? So that we can create outcomes using metadata, right? And that's where we created open metadata project from the ground up. We didn't want to open source it from Uber because Uber has its own technology choices that doesn't work for everybody, right?
Hmm.
And so we decided that we'll build it from the ground up, right, in a scalable manner that is modern, right, based on modern open source technologies. And that's how, open metadata came to be.
Tell us about the challenges of building an open standard for metadata. I mean, data interchange still in 2026 and data integration is still really hard. And that's just the data. Metadata to me is much harder because you're talking a very fine level of description with many layers. Like you said, you have technical, you have these contextual. So tell us about that challenge and how you've gone about making that an open standard.
Yeah, I'll start with small story, right, at Uber, where I actually learned the value of control vocabulary, right? So at Uber,
Mm.
when I joined, people are saying that our data is very hard to use, and I actually, did a study on why it is hard to use. And for Uber, right, some core concepts like location, right, location of a driver, a rider, right, things like that were core to the business. However, when I was looking at how our microservices were designed and how our data warehouse and this online data, right, and offline data analytics data were designed, there was no single definition of what a location is, what a point is, and basic things were defined in an inconsistent manner, right? Somebody had a location with 8 fields, somebody had a location with 2 fields, somebody called point a location, somebody called location a point. So the vocabulary was completely not standardized, right? Was in a disarray. Now, in order to solve this problem, you have to use same consistent vocabulary to mean the same thing, right? So slowly we are going towards semantics and meaning here.
Hmm.
That was missing at Uber, and we ended up defining some standard types, right? What does currency mean? What does currency amount means? What does fair mean? Right? It's a semantic model. Even before defining a structure for that, it's a conceptual semantic model that we had to define. Out of which we ended up defining the structure, right? That's how we built control vocabulary for Uber, right? Of some standard types. That's how I realized the value of control vocabulary. So in case of open metadata, we ended up building control vocabulary for metadata, right? We ended up using it, defining JSON schema. What does it mean, right? When I say control vocabulary, there is, you have tables, right? You have dashboard, right? All of these things are defined using JSON schema. And JSON schema provides you, not only a way of, defining these schemas that is machine readable, that, has description that, both people and machine can consistently understand, but you can also define constraints in your data. What is the right metadata, right? What is the value that can go into a field? If it is email, it has to follow certain format. All of this can also be codified in the schema itself. So that's how we ended up defining control vocabulary for metadata. So we have defined hundreds of different entities related to metadata that captures your entire data landscape, all using standard types that we have also defined using JSON schema that is reused. Right. So that's how we have defined control vocabularies. This we believe should be completely open source. This control vocabulary for metadata, so that anybody can use it, and anybody can influence the direction of this vocabulary, right? So there we have a checkbox. However, the challenge with making sure that this becomes an open standard is being able to work with various different people that are building metadata systems, right? And getting some consensus there and adoption there is quite challenging, right? And this is
Yes.
something that we are working on, right? In order to do this, we need to be part of some kind of a foundation like CNCF, right, where governance of the project itself is clearly defined, where other people can participate and influence the direction. Stay tuned. We are doing some things here where we are opening up the governance of this vocabulary development itself.
Yeah, I'll be blunt, which is that I certainly admire what you folks are doing, but I'm actually wondering how practical this really is. I mean, I can imagine, for instance, that if we're talking about standards on how we specify, for instance, technical metadata, like an email takes this type of format, that I see as a no-brainer. We start defining terminology even within the same organization. You may have different meanings for the word customer, and so if even within an organization it is hard to achieve consensus on that, how in the heck are you going to basically get the world to adopt an open source vocabulary? This sounds to me like a Tower of Babel.
No, it is quite challenging, and there have been attempts at doing these things in the past, right? Look at semantic web, right? The whole idea of
Mhm.
semantic web was to add more meaning to all this HTML data that is available worldwide, right? And it is successful to a certain extent, out of which you've seen schema.org that comes out, right, which was a collaboration between some of very big companies, including Microsoft, that defined vocabulary for the web, right, on what a customer is, what a company is, what an organization is, what a person is, right? What is an email? What is communication? What is an address? This was defined right long back, and the whole idea was to label right the data that is available on the internet with this vocabulary, right? To precisely mean, for example, if Tony Bear, is a person, and this is one specific person. That way, you're searching for somebody. It identifies a specific person, right? Not just name matches, right? um, Things like that were done, and to a certain extent that was successful, right? So these kind of vocabulary development through ontologies is available to us now. What was the challenge with semantic web, right? In case of semantic web, people did not have incentive to go label all this data that is available in the internet, right?
No, yeah,
uh, and versus now you have your own data, right? Now your data is under your control, right? It's not you going to the web and trying to label the entire data within the web, right? Now, your own data, you need to label it because let's look at pre AI, right? In pre AI, the challenges that I've seen is people need descriptions for the data, people needed, quality signals, observability, issues that is there in the data so that they can understand all aspects of data, use it the right way, and create the right outcome, right? That required people describing this data using using simple descriptions, right? Now, the good thing with human beings is when they don't understand, of course, right, there's also a bad aspect to this. Some people make an assumption, and then the assumption is wrong and they create the wrong outcome, right? Versus human beings also, when they don't understand the description, they ask question, right, to somebody who's an expert. They hunt for somebody who's an expert, have hallway conversations, send emails, get clarifications to understand this data better before using it. That's not the case with AI, right? In case of AI, right, AI makes assumptions, hallucinates, and starts using the data based on imprecise descriptions or lack of description. Could just use the name of the data, right, customers, and then make certain assumptions and create certain outcomes that probably are wrong, right? So in case of AI, you need something that is formal, right? The meaning has to be formal. The meaning has to be something that AI can reason about, right, and do inference, right? And it should be machine understandable clearly, and that becomes important, right? And that can be done through overlaying your business concepts using ontologies on top of data that you have. The better you describe your data, both human beings and AI can understand your data, and you can create better outcomes. So it becomes foundational. If it's not an if, right? AI is going to be a technology that will change how we are using and managing our data today, right? And in order for AI to be correct, right, and precise and create the right outcome, the meaning, the semantic ontological overlay of business concept on your data is going to be very important. So it's a necessity.
Let me ask one last question here. And this is basically a version of a question I've asked a lot of our guests because I think this is a hard problem. If I'm running a data team and I want to adopt ontologies and open metadata standards, where do I start? I have a bunch of technical people who maybe aren't super familiar with some of these concepts. How do I start to deploy those technologies?
Yeah. So what I suggest is not boiling the ocean, right? So you know, you can get into typically, right, an organization has maybe under 10, right, concepts that are core to the business, right?
Mm.
So let's take Uber as an example. There is a rider, there's a driver, and there is a fare, right, as a concept, right? And distance traveled within the fare are all different kinds of properties associated with, right, concepts associated with the fare itself, right? Now, start with these kind of core concepts. Now, each of these core concepts could have hundreds of other concepts that are right that are associated with it. I would start with some core concepts and develop it over a period of time, right? Now, these core concepts, needs to be defined through ontologies. And what I would say is, when you're defining these ontologies, use the existing standard ontologies that are already available. There's many ontologies that have been defined by W3C and other standard bodies. You can use it to build your own ontology. And the beauty of this, some of these ontologies, is you can specialize the existing ontology. So, Tony, you were asking about this customer, right? There are different definitions of customers
Mm-hmm.
within a company. You can have one core definition of customer. Maybe you can take this customer definition from a standard ontology that already exists. Then what you can do is you can do specialization on top of this customer. For example, finance department might be looking at customer as with a slightly different definition of what a customer means, right? As long there it maybe it is a paying customer. In case of sales, it might be customer who is who signed the order form, right? And he's still not using your service. For support, it's a customer that is onboarded, right? So you can actually take this core standard definition of customer and specialize it for each of your different domains within the organization, right? So so start with standard ontologies, define your core concepts, and then finally what I would say is look at the business challenges that you're getting, right? Business problems associated with data, and when you're solving them, look at how defining these concepts through ontologies can help you solve your core business problems, right? And start building the ontology, associating it with solving a real business problem. What you don't want to do is sit there and define all kinds of core concepts and sub concepts and try to define all of this at once, right? Do it as it creates value for the organization.
Stick to your knitting and keep it real. Anyway,
Yes.
Suresh, I very much appreciate your taking the time. That you have a very ambitious remit ahead of you. Wish you luck. It's been great talking.
Awesome. Very
Thank you
nice
so
talking to
much.
you guys.
Yeah.
See you
And
later.
I'll be interested to watch your progress. I mean, these open standards projects are very exciting. They're hard, but they're very exciting.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Take
Okay.
care.